I woke up to the familiar sound of Muffin, my orange tabby, scratching at the back door. He had his usual morning routine: wake up, stretch dramatically, and demand breakfast like a tiny, overgrown lion. I shuffled to the kitchen, poured his food, and opened the door so he could get his daily dose of sun. The neighborhood was quiet, the air crisp, and everything seemed perfectly normal. That is, until I spotted her. Karen, standing in her pristine, over-landscaped yard next door, arms folded so tightly across her chest I thought she might snap in half. She was glaring at Muffin, who had casually strutted onto the edge of her grass. I sighed, already knowing this wasn't going to end well. Karen had lived next to me for 2 years, and in that time, she had always found something to complain about. My wind chimes were too loud. My porch light was too bright. My mailbox was an eyesore. And now, apparently, Muffin was her latest problem. Before I could even call him back, Karen let out a dramatic gasp, as if she had just witnessed a crime scene. She stormed toward my porch, her heels clicking against the pavement like a countdown to destruction. "Your beast is trespassing," she shrieked, pointing at Muffin like he was some feral predator. I glanced at my cat, who was now sitting lazily under her hydrangea bush, licking his paw as if he had no idea what all the fuss was about. "Karen, it's a cat," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "He's not trespassing. He's just—" "I knew this would happen," she interrupted, already pulling out her phone. "I've warned you multiple times that I have an extremely delicate garden. Do you have any idea how much money I've spent on this landscaping? And now your flea-ridden stray." "He's not a stray. He's Muffin," I corrected. "Is ruining my petunias. I have allergies, you know. What if I have an attack because of your irresponsible pet ownership? What if he digs up my imported tulip bulbs? Do you even care about the neighborhood's appearance?" I pinched the bridge of my nose. "Karen, he's just sitting there. He's not digging. He's not attacking. He's just existing." But Karen had already turned away, muttering about calling the homeowners association and filing a formal complaint. I watched as she stormed back to her house, slamming the door behind her so hard that I was surprised the windows didn't shatter. Muffin, blissfully unaware of the chaos he had just caused, flopped onto his side and rolled around in the grass like a fuzzy little troublemaker. I figured that was the end of it. I figured wrong. The next morning, there was an envelope stuck to my door. Certified HOA violation notice. I groaned before I even opened it. Sure enough, in bold letters, it read, "Unauthorized animal trespassing and property damage complaint." Underneath it, Karen had written a detailed statement about how Muffin had invaded her yard, trampled her fragile ecosystem, and caused emotional distress. She had even attached pictures, zoomed-in shots of a single paw print in the dirt and a slightly bent flower stem. The whole thing looked less like an official complaint and more like the world's most dramatic crime scene report. I shook my head. This was ridiculous. Absolutely, mind-numbingly ridiculous. I wasn't about to let her intimidate me over something this petty. So I walked next door, knocked once, and waited. Karen opened the door in a silk robe, holding a cup of tea like she was starring in some kind of villainous soap opera. "Oh," she said, feigning surprise. "I assumed you'd be too embarrassed to show your face." I exhaled slowly, forcing a polite smile. "Karen, this notice says Muffin caused significant property damage. I looked at your yard this morning, and it's fine. You can't seriously be trying to." "Fine," she gasped, clutching her chest as if I had just personally insulted her ancestors. "Do you see that flower?" She pointed to a perfectly normal-looking tulip. "That stem is bent, and that dirt disturbed. Your animal has already started destroying my yard, and if I don't put a stop to it now, who knows what will happen next." I stared at her, waiting for her to realize how absurd she sounded. She did not. "You can't own nature, Karen," I said. "Cats wander. They don't recognize property lines." "Then keep your wild animal inside," she snapped. "I've already submitted my official complaint to the HOA, and if you refuse to control your pet, I'll be forced to take legal action." I blinked. "Legal action? You mean—" "Oh yes," she interrupted, a satisfied smirk creeping onto her face. "I'm going to sue you for damages and emotional distress." I laughed. I couldn't help it. A full, genuine, this can't be real kind of laugh. Karen, you're seriously trying to sue me over a cat stepping on your grass? Her eyes narrowed. Just wait until my lawyer contacts you, she said. You'll regret this. And with that, she slammed the door in my face. I stared at the closed door, then down at the HOA notice in my hand. I had dealt with Karen's nonsense before, but this was a new level of insanity. I wasn't going to just roll over and let her bully me into submission. If Karen wanted a war over Muffin, she was about to get one. Karen had officially lost her mind, and now I had a legal battle over Muffin. At first, I thought she was bluffing, just trying to scare me into keeping my cat locked indoors forever. But when a thick envelope arrived in my mailbox a few days later, I knew she was serious. Inside was a formal complaint, filled with ridiculous legal jargon, claiming that Muffin had trespassed on a private property, willfully destroyed an ornamental garden, and inflicted severe emotional distress upon the homeowner. She even attached a medical note from a so-called therapist stating that she had been suffering from heightened anxiety ever since the incident. The letter demanded compensation for damages, emotional suffering, and loss of property value due to my negligence. I couldn't believe my eyes. A cat. She was suing me over a cat. I spent the next few days trying to figure out my next move. I spoke to my neighbor, Greg, who had lived in the neighborhood for over 15 years. He had plenty of stories about Karen and her never-ending complaints, but even he admitted this was a new level of ridiculousness. He suggested that I check the HOA rules carefully because, despite Karen acting like the neighborhood queen, she didn't actually have the power to enforce legal action on behalf of the association. That gave me hope. I spent the entire evening combing through the bylaws, looking for anything that could help. There was nothing about pets needing to stay inside, nothing about gardens being protected from minor disturbances, and absolutely nothing that gave Karen the authority to sue me over a cat walking through her yard. I decided to fight back. I wasn't about to give in to Karen's nonsense. I drafted my own response to the lawsuit, pointing out that Muffin was a domesticated pet, not a wild animal, and that a single bent flower stem did not constitute significant property damage. I also highlighted that Karen's emotional distress claim was laughable. People went through real stress in life, job losses, medical issues, family problems. Karen's biggest worry was a cat touching her grass. I submitted my response to the court and waited. A few days later, I got a call from my lawyer, a friend of Greg's who agreed to take on my case for a minimal fee. He told me that Karen wasn't just filing a lawsuit. She was actually trying to get the HOA involved, demanding that they impose additional fines on me. Apparently, she had convinced a few board members that Muffin was a public nuisance. That was when I realized she wasn't just looking for money. She was trying to get me to leave the neighborhood entirely. She wanted control over everything, and I had unknowingly become her biggest obstacle. That night, I made a decision. If Karen wanted a battle, I would give her one. I started gathering evidence, taking photos of Muffin peacefully lounging on my porch, never causing trouble. I recorded videos of him walking through my own yard, showing that he wasn't some destructive force tearing through gardens. I even asked some of the other neighbors if their security cameras had ever captured Muffin doing anything remotely damaging. One neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, had footage of Muffin simply sitting near Karen's fence while her sprinklers went off. It was clear Karen was exaggerating. As the court date approached, things got worse. Karen started sending out emails to the entire neighborhood, warning them about the dangers of irresponsible pet ownership. She tried to turn people against me, claiming that if Muffin could invade her yard today, then tomorrow it could be someone else's garden. She painted this ridiculous picture of a neighborhood overrun by stray animals, all because I refused to take responsibility. At first, I thought people would see through her nonsense, but surprisingly, a few actually started agreeing with her. Some even put up small signs on their lawns that read, "Keep your pets in your own yard." I was stunned. I knew Karen was manipulative, but I never expected her to actually convince people that a single cat was a serious neighborhood problem. The day of the court hearing finally arrived. I walked into the small courtroom, expecting a straightforward session where the judge would throw out Karen's ridiculous case. But as soon as I saw Karen sitting there with an entire folder of printed evidence, complete with color-coded tabs, I knew this wouldn't be easy. She had brought pages of complaints from various neighbors, exaggerated reports about Muffin's so-called destruction, and even an environmental impact statement claiming that my cat had contributed to soil degradation. I had to fight the urge to roll my eyes. She really thought this would work. The judge, a tired-looking man in his 60s, read over the case details and sighed. He glanced between me and Karen, probably wondering how this had made it into an actual courtroom. Karen wasted no time launching into her speech, describing in dramatic detail how Muffin had terrorized her garden, how she had suffered emotionally, and how the integrity of her property had been compromised. She even dabbed at her eyes with a tissue at one point, pretending to be on the verge of tears. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. I pointed out that there was no proof Muffin had caused any real damage, that Karen had blown everything out of proportion, and that her case was built on exaggeration rather than facts. I showed the judge the video evidence, the security footage, and even a signed statement from a vet confirming that Muffin was well-groomed, flea-free, and incapable of causing any significant destruction. I could see Karen's face turning red with frustration as her case started falling apart. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, Karen pulled out her final weapon, an expert witness. She had somehow convinced a so-called animal behavior specialist to testify that Muffin's behavior was a sign of territorial aggression, and that if left unchecked, he could become a real danger to the neighborhood. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My cat, who spent most of his time napping and chasing his own tail, was now being painted as some sort of predator. The judge listened patiently, then turned to me and asked a simple question. "Do you have anything else to say?" I nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. Just one thing." I pulled out a printed copy of the HOA bylaws and pointed to the pet regulations. Nowhere in these rules does it state that a pet walking onto someone else's lawn is a violation. Nowhere does it say that a cat stepping on grass is a finable offense. Karen has been trying to control this neighborhood for years, and this lawsuit isn't about a cat. It's about her wanting to dictate how everyone lives their lives. She wants to punish me for not bending to her every ridiculous demand. And honestly, Your Honor, I think the court's time is better spent on real cases, not a neighbor's personal vendetta. The room fell silent. The judge stared at me for a long moment, then turned to Karen. She opened her mouth, but for the first time, she had nothing to say. The judge tapped his pen against his desk, glancing between me and Karen. The room was so silent that I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. He sighed, adjusted his glasses, and leaned forward. It was clear he had heard enough nonsense for one day. He cleared his throat and began speaking, his voice firm but tired. He pointed out that Karen's case lacked substantial evidence, and that emotional distress over a cat simply being in a yard was, in legal terms, absurd. He mentioned that there was no law preventing a cat from walking into another yard, and unless Karen could provide undeniable proof that Muffin had caused severe damage, there was no basis for the lawsuit. He even took a moment to flip through her so-called expert witness statement before shaking his head, unimpressed. He turned to me and asked if I had any damages to claim in return, considering all the stress this unnecessary lawsuit had caused me. I thought about it for a moment, tempted to ask for compensation for all the wasted time, but I shook my head. I just wanted this to be over. Karen, however, wasn't done. She sat up straight, gripping the edges of the table like a drowning woman reaching for a lifeline. She insisted that she had suffered real emotional harm, that she had been unable to enjoy her own home because of the constant fear that Muffin would return. She ranted about how the HOA needed stronger rules and how this case was about maintaining the dignity of the neighborhood. The judge let her speak, his face blank, and when she was done, he simply said, "Miss Karen, a cat walking into your yard is not a legal emergency. This case is dismissed." The sound of his gavel hitting the desk was final. It was over, or so I thought. Karen stormed out of the courtroom before I even had time to gather my papers. She muttered something about appealing the decision, but even she knew she had lost. I walked outside, took a deep breath, and enjoyed the moment. The sun was shining, and for the first time in weeks, I felt at peace. I assumed Karen would take the loss, stew in her misery for a while, and eventually move on to some other ridiculous complaint. But, of course, underestimated her. 2 days later, HOA violation notices started appearing on my doorstep. At first, I thought it was just one final petty move, but then they kept coming. One for my grass being half an inch too long. Another for my porch light being too bright. Then one for a supposed unauthorized modification to my fence, even though I had never changed it. It was clear what was happening. Karen, furious over her court loss, had decided to use the HOA as her weapon of revenge. She must have spent all night digging through every single regulation to find anything she could twist into a violation. She wasn't going to let go of this fight so easily. I tried ignoring it at first, but then came the fines. They started small, $50 here, $100 there. Then they escalated. I received a letter stating that if I didn't correct my multiple violations within 30 days, the HOA would take further action, including potential legal consequences. I laughed at first, thinking it was just another empty threat. But then I remembered, Karen wasn't just a bitter neighbor. She was manipulative, and she had friends on the HOA board who would back her up, no matter how ridiculous her claims were. She wasn't trying to find me. She was trying to push me out of the neighborhood entirely. That night, I sat down with a cup of coffee and went through every letter, every notice, every fine. I could fight some of them, but the truth was dealing with the HOA was like fighting a brick wall. It didn't matter how unfair it was. As long as Karen had influence, she could make my life miserable. I knew I needed a different approach. So, I decided to take a page from Karen's own book. If she wanted to play dirty, I would show her just how much trouble I could cause in return. The next morning, I went online and started researching HOA rules in depth. Not just the ones in my neighborhood, but HOA laws in general, including loopholes, legal restrictions, and ways to challenge board decisions. I found out that many HOAs operated under strict guidelines that, if violated, could actually put them at risk of lawsuits themselves. The more I read, the more I realized that Karen had been bending the rules for years, finding people for things that weren't even legal violations. And that's when I found the most important piece of information. The HOA was required to have a public financial report available to all residents upon request. I walked down to the HOA office that afternoon and asked for a copy. The woman behind the desk looked nervous, saying I would need to submit a written request. I did. A week passed, and I heard nothing. I sent another request. Still nothing. It was clear they were hiding something. So, I decided to take things a step further. I reached out to a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes and asked if it was legal for them to withhold financial records. He confirmed what I suspected: it wasn't. By law, they had to provide them within a reasonable time frame. Armed with that knowledge, I sent a final notice, this time mentioning that I was prepared to file a formal complaint with the state's HOA regulatory board if they failed to comply. Less than 48 hours later, I received an envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a rushed, hastily printed financial report, full of confusing numbers and vague expenses. I combed through every line, and then I saw it. Karen had been using HOA funds for her personal benefit. There were repeated payments labeled as landscaping reimbursement, all linked to her address. Thousands of dollars over the past 2 years had gone directly into her pockets under the guise of neighborhood maintenance. She had been scamming the HOA right under everyone's noses. I could have gone straight to the board, but I knew they wouldn't act. Not as long as Karen had influence. So instead, I did what she had done to me. I went straight to the people. I printed out copies of the financial report, highlighted the suspicious transactions, and mailed them to every single homeowner in the neighborhood. I included a letter explaining what I had found, along with details about how Karen had been using her position to push out residents she didn't like. Within days, the neighborhood was in chaos. Homeowners were furious. People started knocking on my door, thanking me for exposing her. A few even admitted they had been afraid to speak up against Karen for years because of how vindictive she was. An emergency HOA meeting was scheduled, and this time, it wasn't about Muffin. It was about Karen. By the time the meeting was held, word had spread like wildfire. Nearly every resident showed up, demanding answers. Karen, for the first time, looked nervous. She tried to defend herself, claiming that all expenses had been approved, but when asked to provide actual receipts, she had nothing. The HOA board had no choice. By the end of the night, Karen was removed from her position, and an investigation was launched into the misuse of funds. The best part? The HOA was now facing a lawsuit of its own from multiple homeowners who were tired of Karen's reign of terror. I watched the whole thing unfold with the satisfaction of knowing that the woman who had tried to destroy my life over a cat had finally been taken down by her own greed. That night, I sat on my porch with Muffin curled up beside me, the cool breeze rolling in as peace finally returned to the neighborhood. For the first time in a long time, everything was quiet. No more threats, no more nonsense, no more Karen. And as I looked down at Muffin, lazily stretching out in the moonlight, I couldn't help but laugh. All of this, over a cat. With Karen finally removed from her position, I thought life in the neighborhood would return to normal. But I had underestimated the level of chaos she had left behind. The HOA was now in complete disarray, struggling to recover from the financial scandal. Residents were demanding refunds, questioning past fines, and even threatening to sue for the way they had been harassed under Karen's rule. The board members who had supported her were now pretending they had never agreed with her in the first place, backtracking on their decisions and acting as if they were victims too. Meanwhile, Karen had gone completely silent. I hadn't seen her in days. Her once perfectly maintained yard was starting to look neglected, her garbage bins left out longer than usual, her car sitting untouched in the driveway. It was like she had vanished. At first, I thought maybe she was hiding out of embarrassment, but I had a strange feeling that she wasn't done yet. My suspicion was confirmed when I got home one evening and found a thick envelope waiting for me in my mailbox. My heart sank. I had hoped I was finally free from her madness, but the second I saw her name on the return address, I knew this wasn't over. I ripped it open and pulled out a handwritten letter, pages long, detailing all the ways she believed I had ruined her life. She accused me of orchestrating a witch hunt against her, of brainwashing the neighbors, and of turning her into a laughingstock. She wrote about how she had given years of service to the community, only to be betrayed by the very people she had tried to help. But the part that stood out the most was the final paragraph, her promise that she wasn't going down without a fight. She had hired a new lawyer. She was planning to sue the HOA itself for wrongful termination, and she was preparing a defamation case against me personally. My stomach tightened. Just when I thought I had won, she was gearing up for round two. The next few weeks were exhausting. The HOA, still scrambling to clean up the mess Karen had left behind, wanted nothing to do with her threats. They were too busy trying to figure out how to handle all the residents who were now demanding changes to the rules, refunds for their unjust fines, and in some cases, complete resignations of the entire board. Meanwhile, Karen had started sending out letters to everyone in the neighborhood, claiming she was the victim of a conspiracy. Most people ignored her, but a few, either too gullible or too spiteful, actually believed her story and started defending her. They accused the new HOA leadership of acting unfairly, claiming that Karen had only been enforcing the rules and that I had led an unfair smear campaign against her. It was insane. The same people who had suffered under Karen's reign were now calling her a wrongfully accused woman. I realized then that no matter how much evidence you provide, some people will always believe what they want to believe. Things escalated further when I found out Karen had started reaching out to local media outlets, trying to spin the story in her favor. I was scrolling through my phone one afternoon when I came across a news segment titled, "Former HOA President Speaks Out, Victim of Neighborhood Harassment." I clicked on it, and there she was, sitting in a perfectly staged interview, pretending to be the innocent victim of a cruel attack. She talked about how she had only been trying to protect community standards and how she had been unfairly removed by an angry mob. She even mentioned me by name, painting me as a troublemaker who had a personal vendetta against her. I nearly choked on my coffee. This woman was truly unbelievable. But what really set me off was when she pulled out Muffin's picture, holding it up to the camera and calling him a known nuisance animal. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. She described Muffin as a feral threat, claiming that he had been terrorizing the neighborhood, knocking over garbage cans, and even scratching children. It was a complete fabrication, and yet, here she was, saying it with absolute confidence, knowing that at least some people would believe her. I shut off the video and sat there, fuming. She wasn't just trying to repair her reputation. She was trying to drag me down with her. I knew then that I had to put an end to this once and for all. The next morning, I started making calls. First, I reached out to the news station that had aired the segment, demanding a right to respond. I sent them security footage, photos, and statement from multiple neighbors proving that Muffin was harmless and that Karen had lied. I also reached out to an investigative journalist who had covered HOA corruption in the past, tipping him off about the financial scandal Karen had been involved in. If she wanted to play dirty, I was going to hit back harder. And it worked. Within a week, a new report aired, exposing Karen's misuse of HOA funds and detailing the long list of ridiculous fines and lawsuits she had thrown at people over the years. They even included an interview with one of her former supporters who had turned against her after realizing how manipulative she was. The tide had officially turned against her. But Karen wasn't finished yet. She made one final, desperate move. She tried to sue me for defamation. I received an official legal notice in the mail, claiming that my false accusations had caused her irreparable harm and that she was demanding a public apology and financial compensation. I laughed as I read through it. She had no case. Everything I had said about her was backed up by facts, by public records, and by witness statements. But just to be safe, I called my lawyer, who assured me that the lawsuit wouldn't hold up in court. He filed a motion to dismiss it immediately, and within days, it was thrown out. Karen had officially lost on all fronts. The last time I saw her, she was loading up a moving truck. It was early in the morning, the sky still gray from the rising sun, and she was barking orders at the movers while stuffing boxes into the back of her car. She looked furious, her face twisted with anger as she muttered under her breath. I stood on my porch, sipping my coffee, watching as she packed up the last of her things. She must have felt my gaze because she turned suddenly, locking eyes with me. For a brief moment, we just stared at each other. Then, without a word, she climbed into her car, slammed the door, and sped off down the street. Just like that, she was gone. The neighborhood felt lighter after that. People started chatting more, gathering in their yards without fear of being fined for something ridiculous. The HOA, now under new leadership, rolled back many of Karen's old policies, making life easier for everyone. The ridiculous fines stopped, the complaints died down, and for the first time in years, it actually felt like a community again. As for me, I finally got to enjoy my home without the constant stress of dealing with Karen's nonsense. And Muffin? Well, he continued being his lazy, happy self, completely unaware of the war that had been fought in his name. A few weeks later, as I sat on my porch watching Muffin stretch out in the sunlight, a neighbor walked by and waved. "Looks like we finally got our neighborhood back," she said with a smile. I nodded, taking a sip of my coffee. "Yeah," I said, "and all it took was a cat."